Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Laura Mullen, and on behalf of ACRL and Choice, I'd like to welcome you to today's program, Insights from the Machiavellian Librarian, sponsored by Elsevier and featuring Megan Hodge and Laura Francabandera. Today's discussion is one in a series of sponsored webinars from ACRL and Choice that addresses new ideas, developments, and products of interest to the academic library community. Free to users, these structured 60-minute live presentations provide the opportunity for interactive discussions of important new issues and developments in academic librarianship by librarians, vendors, authors, and other interested stakeholders. Before we get started, I'd like to point out a few features of the webinar software. In the main area of the screen, you can follow along with the presentation materials. Along the left-hand side, you will also see a Q&A panel that you can use to submit questions or comments. We'll spend some time responding to your questions during the program, so please do feel free to submit those questions throughout. And finally, please note that today's program will be recorded and all registrants will receive follow-up instructions on how to access the archived version. And now I'd like to introduce today's presenters. Megan Hodge is a teaching and learning librarian at Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond, Virginia. She earned her Master of Science in Library Science from the University of North Texas in 2010 and is a 2014-2015 president of the ALA New Members Roundtable. In 2011, she was an ALA Emerging Leader and co-founded the Virginia New Members Roundtable. Laura Francabandera is the Senior E-Learning Technology Coordinator for Credo Reference, a provider of online reference content and information skills solutions dedicated to helping students and library patrons build the information skills necessary for academic, professional, and personal success. After a decade in corporate management, Laura received her MLIS from San Jose State University. She has presented at ALA conferences and Charleston conferences. And with that, I'd now like to turn things over to Megan Hodge.
Thanks, Laura, for the introduction. So my chapter, which is called Prince or Plebe, Success at All Levels of the Library Hierarchy, focuses on optimizing the middle manager's experience. And to clarify what I mean by middle manager, that's someone who has people reporting to them, even if those people are students rather than grown-up staff. But this person also reports to someone else. So you don't have to be a middle manager yourself to benefit from what I'm going to talk about today. The joy of middle management means that you report to someone else as well as supervising others. So that means there's going to be advice for frontline employees as well as supervisors. Obviously, these are just a few of the things that I talk about in greater detail in the book chapter. And in case you're worrying about my creds on what my experience is on this, I wrote this chapter based on my experiences as a middle manager at both an academic and a public library. So before we launch into that, I want to kind of clear the air about Machiavelli. He's got kind of a reputation for being this devious, grasping, ambitious kind of guy. Shakespeare even called him murderous Machiavel, which may in fact have colored the way we view Machiavelli today in society, since so much of what Shakespeare wrote has been written into our culture. But if you actually read The Prince, a lot of what he writes is just realistic or pragmatic advice. And some of the things that he writes are surprisingly relevant for the working world, even though he wrote this 500 years ago in very different circumstances. So I'm kind of going to start from the top and work my way down. So I'm going to start with some strategies for supervisors. And my first strategy is leading by example. This is, I think, one of the most important things that you can keep in mind as a supervisor, and also one of the trickiest, because the greatest influence you ever exert over the people that you supervise might be unconsciously wielded. Take a minute to think about what your subordinates are taking away from your leadership style. To kind of get an idea of how important this is, take a minute to think about how you feel about your own boss and how you've unconsciously or consciously modified your behavior because of things that they do or don't do. So we've probably all had terrible bosses in our past histories, whether that's in library land or whether that's in retail, some job that you had before the library. And I'm sure that we've probably all thought to ourselves, we've had an experience with that terrible boss. When I become a supervisor, I hope I never do, X thing that my terrible boss is doing. And it doesn't even have to be an example, that obvious. How do you handle people in meetings who like to dominate the conversation? These are the sort of subconscious things that you are doing that your employees are looking at. So, for example, I've made it a personal goal for myself not to ask anything of subordinates that I'm not willing to do myself. So that could be as simple as handling patrons who are known to have anger issues, or to reveal my public librarian roots, corralling an area that has human excrement in it, for example. Taking on these less nice tasks are a way to show your employees that you understand where they're coming from, that you're not better than them. Another aspect of leading by example is not gossiping or saying anything negative about your library or the employees there. If you do this, you have the potential of making your subordinates wonder what you're saying about them, if you are speaking the same way about them behind their back as you are talking about some of the other employees. One of the ways that leading by example is really important when rolling out new policies is taking on that role as supporting your library and its administration, even if you disagree with them. So if you have a controversial policy that needs to be rolled out that you don't necessarily agree with, part of your job, one of your duties is to help your employees understand that new policy, not least because they're not as likely to follow those policies in the spirit they were intended if they don't understand the policy's purpose. So if you have a new policy about, staffing the reference desk, for example, and they don't understand why that policy has been implemented, there's likely to be, pushback, and it might not be implemented in the way you'd like. Similarly, frustration with those frontline employees is less likely to occur when they know that you face the same issues as them by working on the front lines. So obviously this is going to be difficult the larger your library is and the higher up that administrative food chain you go. But if you can, take a regular chat shift or teach a class once in a while, keep your finger in that frontline pie, so to speak. So that way if you do have to make a decision that affects, say, staffing on the front lines, your employees are more likely to understand that the policy change, really is in the best interest of the library and the patrons and not coming from a space of misinformation. Okay, so my next strategy is mentoring promising employees. Obviously, you want to have a positive relationship with all your employees and coworkers, but special attention ought to be paid to those who show exceptional interest or drive. So these employees are the ones who have the most potential to advance inside your library and also outside in the library profession. And because they're such exceptional employees, they're probably more likely to be receptive to any advice you have for them. So I'm not saying that you ought to make obvious teachers' pets out of them, but these employees, if they're really promising, if they're driven and full of ideas, depending on the workplace, those same traits that make them awesome employees potentially puts them at higher risk of getting burnt out or disillusioned if their ideas keep getting shot down or if their hard work is going unrecognized. This is something that Stephen Abram has written about a couple times, actually, this phenomenon of high potential employees and just leaving their library and sometimes even leaving the library profession totally. They move to another industry. So this is obviously a lose-lose for everyone. So if you can, if you have these promising employees, kind of under your purview, share the political navigation strategies that have worked best for you. If you know that there's a certain way that administrators like to receive proposals, there's a certain format, a certain timeline they like to receive them in, share those political navigation strategies with them. Hopefully, these sorts of things will prevent your employees' morale from sinking, which would in turn hopefully keep them from losing productivity and jumping ship. Okay, moving on to some of the more universally applicable advice, I'm going to talk about success as an employee. So the first strategy I have is excelling in the job that you were hired for. This is going to be true for all employees, but especially true for ones that are closer to the front line. So especially important for people who are working the front lines. If you have aspirations of becoming a library director one day, for example, or you're bursting with great ideas, so if you're, consider yourself one of those star employees, but if you don't do the job that you were hired for, you might not gain a huge amount of support for those ideas if you come into your new job all cannons firing, a few weeks after you start or a month or two after you start complaining about how things are done, how things could be so much better at your library if you did them a certain other way. If you take the time instead to establish yourself as not just a competent but an outstanding employee, your supervisors are going to be less concerned that you won't have the time to work on these amazing ideas. First and foremost, your supervisors and administration are going to want you to do the job that was in the job description that you applied for. If you're able to do that and have extra time left over for these other big projects that you have thought of, then fantastic. But first and foremost, they're going to want you to get the job done that you were hired for. Similarly, along these same lines, your coworkers and, more importantly, your supervisors are more likely to feel annoyed that you haven't taken the time to understand the politics and history of your current workplace if you, again, come in with all cannons firing with a new job, trying to make changes. So if you, for example, want to start up a chat reference service and it's something that was tried 10 years ago and it didn't work, it might just get shot down. However, if you are aware of the politics and the history of an idea at your institution, and you take the time to learn those, you're going to be able to propose change in a way that will acknowledge whatever that politics and that history is, and demonstrate how your application of that idea would be different, and therefore make it more successful. The next strategy is persevering when told no. This is sort of related to the previous one. So if you propose an idea and it doesn't go through the time that you proposed it, it doesn't mean it won't necessarily work in the future. So it's important to keep in mind that you can try again with an idea. Perhaps the person who you originally spoke with wasn't in a good mood. Maybe something was happening at home. It just wasn't a great time. Perhaps you pitched it to the wrong person or not in the right way. It's important not to lose hope, to do your research. If you have a mentor, it's a good idea to talk to them. They can hopefully advise you about whether your idea is truly off base or possibly give you advice on how to make it better, more likely to be implemented. But, pitch it again. Choose your audience and your moment carefully, but don't give up hope on your idea if it's something you're really passionate about. I'm actually going to speak a little bit more about successfully pitching an idea in a moment as we move on to strategies for subordinates. And we're all subordinates, actually. We all report to someone, even library directors. This is hopefully going to be some of the most useful advice. This first strategy, how to propose an idea in a way that gets administrative buy-in, is the one out of all the ones I wrote about, all the ones I'm speaking about today, that I'm most passionate about, the one that's dearest to my heart. And I feel like this comes from my experience as both a frontline employee and as a manager. Managers are really busy people, and I feel like there's a disconnect, however, between what managers do and what their employees think they do, and that this disconnect gets larger the higher up the administrative chain you go. The trouble with library work is that, a lot of times you are sitting at your desk and you might not look busy because you're just sitting at your desk, so your employees can't tell what you're working on. However, managers obviously are busy, which means they don't necessarily have time to discuss all of their concerns with you if you present an idea to them. So if you have an idea that has the potential to make the library look bad, they may just dismiss it out of hand rather than sit down and talk to you about how to adapt that proposal into a workable one. And this doesn't mean that your supervisor is being mean. It is their job as a supervisor to think about their own boss, how to make their boss look good, how to make the library look good. And it's their job to not just rubber stamp any idea you present to them, but to look at it critically. What are all the things that could possibly go wrong? So if you present your idea in a way that acknowledges the demands on their time, they're more likely to read your proposal and therefore be persuaded by that proposal. One of the worst things you can do is bring up a problem to your supervisor without offering a solution. So I don't mean here, don't tell your supervisor that your chat software is not working. Obviously, they're going to want to know about that. But if there's a policy that isn't working, don't just say, the reference desk scheduling is not working and leave it at that. If you can come up with an idea to solve that problem, you're going to be racking up brownie points with your supervisor. So the proposal format that I use is from Library Director Elizabeth Doucette's book, What They Don't Teach You in Library School, but you don't have to buy the book to get this proposal format. If you just Google 10 tips for tracking trends, with 10 as the number 10, not the word 10, it's step 8. And I love, love, love this proposal because I have been using it for about 5 years now. And literally, I have not had a single idea proposal turned down since I started using this. And that's not just because it's me submitting proposals. If we're going to be somewhat scientific about this, I tried submitting some of the same proposals without that form beforehand, and they got shot down. So this form is just wonderful. And its genius is that it not only makes you summarize the origin of your idea and its benefits, which is something that all idea pitches are hopefully going to talk about. This format also discusses the potential pitfalls and costs of the idea. So this is demonstrating to your supervisor that you've thought through the implications, you've thought through the potential drawbacks, and have hopefully thought of some solutions. So these are things that your supervisor is not going to have to think about on their own. You've solved that problem for them and saved their time. So really recommend using that form. I really love it. So it's 10 tips for tracking trends. Okay, and my final bit of advice is learning and taking to heart your library's mission. And this is something that I've seen in my own experience, that a lot of the most politically astute libraries align their own missions with that of their parent organizations. So in academic libraries, that's whatever university or college generally that the library serves. And that's because the parent organization is held responsible for, often fiscally or, just really, really responsible for, like, accreditation-wise, whatever their mission is. And therefore, they really care about fulfilling their own mission. So if the parent organization has a certain mission, then the library, if they can work their own mission to be, dovetailing with that, you're more likely to get funding for the library, for example. So to give you all an example, teaching professors about copyright so they avoid accidental copyright infringement is absolutely a noble objective, but libraries are unlikely to get budget support for that sort of initiative unless they tie those initiatives to the goals of their funders. Libraries and universities, higher ed, this is not a place of endless money. There's a limited number of budget dollars that can be spent, and if there's a choice between, a noble objective and one that's less noble but actually fulfills the mission, then those dollars are going to be spent on fulfilling the mission of the library, the mission of the parent institution. So just keep your library's mission in mind, your larger institution's mission in mind as you're thinking about proposing ideas. More likely to get your ideas accepted and pushed forward if they align with that mission. And also, it's a good thing to keep in mind, a good thing to have thought about this mission of your library in case you get caught in the elevator with, say, your library director. That's always a potentially awkward moment, right? You've got this couple minutes with one of the most powerful people in your library, and you don't really know what to say. But if you are familiar with your library's mission and maybe have something intelligent to say about something you're working on that aligns with that mission, you're going to be earning some brownie points with your library director. Oh, and Cindy has posted is going to be posting the link to that top tracking trends. Thank you, Cindy. So to close, I'd just like to say that regardless of how static you feel your current situation is, even if you feel that you're not in a position where there's room for advancement, even if you feel like you don't have a lot of autonomy to do what you want to do in your position, I really, really strongly feel that you have the ability to affect change in your own life and the workplace and the library profession in general, just by not giving up. If you all are familiar with the ALA think tank on Facebook, part of their motto is make it happen. So what this means is even if you're a library school student, that you have the ability to make positive change happen, around you. And I've seen this happen over and over in library land, so I feel really, really strongly about this. Obviously, making great change, great positive change does take work, as most great things do. So you are going to need to set goals and, potentially find other people who keep you motivated if you're not in a workplace where your coworkers are keeping you motivated. But hold on to your passion. I really strongly believe that you can make fantastic things happen if you just keep working for it. So to close, I'd like to share with you some words from an author who wrote about using Machiavelli's tenets in the corporate world, a guy named Stanley Bing, who wrote that every day in every way, ask yourself the key question that transforms a middle manager into a CEO. What would Machiavelli do? And with that, I'd like to pass it over to Laura Francabandera.
Thank you, Megan. Megan had a really great look into kind of the internal politics, so I'm going to look a little outward from the library. My presentation is entitled Acquiring New Principalities, Helping Student Athletes at Their Point of Need. And in The Prince, Machiavelli said, those who by valorous ways become princes, they acquire a principality with difficulty, but they keep it with ease. And as library budgets are shrinking and we're forced to do more with less, it can be really hard to think of expanding our sphere of influence and adding just one more thing to your to-do list because we all wear many different hats. But it is very important. It's a natural wish. Machiavelli said it's a natural wish to acquire more things, and it's very natural and very common. So it's even common to librarians, and it's very important also. In this presentation, I want to set forth a new model of librarianism that really focuses on expanding library services beyond the expected borders to reach underserved student populations who may not normally be able to come to the library. Specifically, I wanted to give you really concrete examples of what you can do with the resources you have at hand to help student athletes. And by helping student athletes, you do expand your own influence, you prove the library's value, you conquer new library territory, and you really, at the bottom line above everything we do, is to help students succeed. So the ultimate question, when we start talking about how the library can help student athletes is, what can we do for multi-million-dollar athletic departments? I mentioned how budgets are shrinking in the library. We're having to do more with less, and it seems in the athletic world that more is always better. So we see these multi-million-dollar athletic departments with new facilities and new stadiums and 3-story high television screens. So, what can we do for them? It's surprisingly a lot. I wanted to give a bit of background information about student athletes first that I think might help and give you some context. Because not everyone knows about the NCAA requirements or what student athletes really face and what really differentiates them from regular students. So the NCAA requires student athletes to meet very specific academic benchmarks, really beyond simple GPA criteria, to be eligible to compete athletically. So one benchmark is called the degree completion rate. So the NCAA says that they have to complete 40% of their coursework toward their degree by the end of their second year, 60% by the end of their third, and 80% by the end of their fourth. They're given 5 years total to graduate. In addition to the degree completion rate, the NCAA has also assigned what's called an academic progress rate. So that's more of a team-based score, and that really gives athletes the impetus to succeed, and it's very much more team-oriented because your grade doesn't just affect you, it affects the whole team. So the entire point of these two scores is to make sure that, that they're on track, that student athletes don't just take easy courses for the sake of good grades, but they're actually taking courses that are required for their degree. But just because these benchmarks are in place doesn't necessarily mean that they're followed. As the recent scandals, if anyone's been following some of the news, but there's paper courses out there that are courses that only require a very small, lightly graded writing sample to pass the course. Those have recently rocked the athletic world of some really, really famous institutions. And really, student athletes, they're just continually being let down by trusted people, even within their own institution, who really don't have their best interests at heart, but rather are looking for the institution's best interests or the athletic department as a whole, the best interest. So this is really a prime opportunity for librarians to just step into the gap. So I really wanted to take a brief mention of Louisiana State University. So one example of librarians and athletic departments working together is LSU, and they have a full-service academic success center for their student athletes. And in that, they make available really dedicated learning specialists. They have subject-specific tutors. They have career development liaisons. Excuse me. They have lots of facilities. The amazing thing about this, though, they had no librarians. So Credo partnered with them to really bridge that gap and bring library resources straight to the student athletes. And as we were doing that, one thing that we really learned was that what works for the average student in our normal instruction, whether it's face-to-face or a one-shot, whatever our normal average student interaction is, it may not work for student athletes. They really are a different kind of animal. They have unique needs. They have really particular stressors like media attention or travel schedules, professional scouts that the average student just doesn't have. So the library can really work with these needs to create something really unique just for student athletes. So that leaves us at the question is really how can you help? It brings us back to it's kind of a David and Goliath. We look at these athletic departments with lots and lots of money, and we feel very small and under budgeted, but we have a lot of tools at our disposal. So the first thing I want to keep in mind is that the student athletes keep their needs in mind. They often do their schoolwork while they're traveling or on the go. So really the best way to reach them is through online or distance learning. Videos and podcasts that they can listen to while traveling or on an airplane or on a bus. Tutorials and quizzes that maybe they can take online at the hotel, or library resource guides they can access after practice if the library is closed. And librarians can also network with athletic tutors. Every student athlete has a tutor. So if librarians can network with those tutors, we can have that channel to get the library resources straight to the student when they need them. Even if the librarian is not available, at least the tutor will have the resources needed. And then we can also take this as an opportunity to really go beyond the general information literacy instruction that we normally do and consider it a type of subject-specific department. You know, as like I mentioned, they have their own unique needs. So maybe you can make some information, a guide about NCAA compliance or how to avoid extra benefits. You know, they really need to know how to recognize concussions or how to deal with the press and what not to say on social media because, you know, they might be famous later and it could ruin their career. So, you know, it's just really important to recognize that they're unique needs. And then underneath all of that, of course, you know, they also need citation help and how to avoid plagiarism and the regular library information. So, you know, it's kind of a two-tiered needs. You have the regular student needs, but then they also have all these other needs that, you know, I think you can really blend information literacy and extend it into their actual needs. So, you know, like I mentioned, whether it is recognizing concussions or avoiding extra benefits, making sure that they can still play and be eligible. So, you know, you have a lot of tools at hand, and they're mostly free or low-cost things that you can really make these items, whether it's multimedia or videos or screencasts or library guides, really whatever you need to do to get the information to the student athletes. There are a lot of tools out there that you can use. So some of the ones that I've used that are really useful are Adobe Captivate, Articulate Storyline, SoftChalk. You know, those can all create interactive modules and tutorials, quizzes, and, you know, they do cost money. There are free types of things like Mozilla Popcorn Maker. It's a really fun way to annotate videos or screencasts with fun pop-ups. You know, you can find ways to do quizzes, whether it's doing polls or SurveyMonkey. You can use free blog software like WordPress or Joomla to really just create that communication channel, which is the most important thing. So no matter what kind of tool you use, the most important thing is to create that channel and get the information to the student athletes where and when they need it. So I really just wanted to conclude and say that the tools, you know, they're here and they're available. They're not very expensive or free. And really all you need now is just the courage to go out and do it. You know, it'll mean some work. Like Machiavelli said, acquiring new territory can be difficult. You know, you will have to go out there and hit the pavement or, you know, make a lunch date or go through the channels, the internal politics between the athletic department and the library or the academic institution. You know, there will be some uncharted waters to navigate, and it can be very difficult. But, you know, the rewards are really worth it to help serve that this really underserved student population that people just don't think of. You know, they think that student athletes have it all together and that they're really well served because the athletic departments are so well funded, but that's not entirely the truth. So I wanted to thank you all, and I think we're going to open this now for question and answers. So we've had a few come in. I know Cindy put in the link to Megan's article in the chat box. But if you have any questions about mine or Megan's presentation, please feel free to type it into the Q&A chat box. And then there will also be a transcript after the webinar that will be available to you. Isabel said that when she was a student at LSU, the SLIS listserv had called for library students to be tutors, and that is a really fantastic idea to, you know, not burden the librarian, but bring in library students. So I think if all institutions, you know, it's a great thing for maybe an internship or something for the library student to get the experience, I think that's a fantastic idea. Some of the online teaching tools that I mentioned, besides the two on the slide it's Captivate and Articulate. Some of the other ones I mentioned were Soft Chalk, which is an online HTML website building software, and it does have quizzing capability, and I even believe it can be integrated into a learning management system. And then I mentioned Mozilla Popcorn Maker from the makers of Firefox, and it's a fun way to annotate videos. So you can put captions or quotes or stickers, whatever you want on the video. And then, for quizzes, there's Poll Everywhere. It can be a little dangerous to use if you're actually using it like face-to-face. But, and then SurveyMonkey can easily be used for quizzing as well.
There's a question that just came in for Megan. Megan, what are some of the changes that you requested, and were they successful?
Okay, so that's going back to the proposal format that I mentioned earlier, which, by the way, Cindy has sent the link to all of you for that proposal format, and it's step 8 on that proposal format. So some of the things that I requested, one of the things that's off the top of my head that I tried once on my own and was shot down was setting up a Facebook page for my library. And I tried again a little while later using this proposal format that I mentioned in my talk, and it, my library director, didn't even read all the way through the proposal. I think she just saw, she just looked at it so quickly. She saw that I had outlined what the negatives potentially were and that I'd address those, and she just gave me the go-ahead. So that's an example.
Megan, how would you channel the Prince in dealing with vendors?
Well, I will admit that I have very little experience dealing with vendors. That's just not something I've needed to do in terms of my actual job responsibilities. But if I were to take a page out of the Prince, I would say that you ought to try to think like the vendors. Try to think where they're coming from. Obviously they have to meet a certain bottom line as well. And just, if you have any contacts who work at vendors, people you're friendly with, set up a chat with them, kind of, figure out what they're, how they think about things. If you've got like when you're putting out a submission for bids, for example, figure out how that process works, what they're really trying to get at. And if you can see from the vendor's point of view, that will help you adapt how you should interact with them. Maybe you could phrase things in a different way, in a way that would be better understood, would be more likely to happen if you speak it in this way that's understandable to the vendor.
Thank you, Megan. We have a question for Laura. Laura, are librarians more directly involved in the support services offered by the athletic department?
And for that, I think it really depends on the institution. I have seen athletic departments that are very closely tied with the librarians, so they have done a lot of the support. Like they have a special chat reference just for student athletes where they can offer on-the-fly citation advice or something like that. And then I've also seen the other side of the spectrum where there's really no crossover at all. So it really, I think, just depends on how willing the librarian is to offer that support and to make that time in an already busy schedule or an already understaffed library, adding that one extra thing. But it can be done. I think it just depends on how willing the librarian is.
Thank you, Laura. Do we have any other questions? If there are any questions, if you can type them into the Q&A portion. And while we're waiting, Megan, did you have anything else you would like to add?
I did mention in passing, benefiting from a mentor, a professional mentor. So I wanted to, sure I can expand on that for just a minute. That's something that I expand on in the full chapter in the book. So I feel like having a mentor, especially in the same institution that you're working for, can be really, really helpful. And it doesn't even have to be a formal mentoring relationship where you two meet on a regular basis and, have plans to talk about certain things, where you acknowledge that person as as a mentor. If you find someone who is just really politically savvy in your institution, someone who's probably a few rungs above you in that administrative hierarchy, and just look at how they do things and kind of model your behavior after them. What would they do in a certain situation? How would they navigate a particular situation if there's, a discussion with an administrator? How do they interact with that administrator? Just modeling your behavior after what they do, I found to be very, very helpful for myself, and this is something that I've observed in other librarians as well, just modeling your behavior after someone in your institution who has been very successful.
I don't think there are any other questions, but I know that there is a link to Elsevier's Learning Trends, and that will take you to a free EPUB download of some of the chapters that that come from the Machiavellian Librarian, as well as a couple of other books. And the EPUB, the free EPUB, is called Marketing the Academic Library. So if you'd like, I encourage you to check it out. Is there anything else? Any other questions? Oh.
Okay. Well, I'd like to give our presenters a virtual round of applause for spending some time with us today and sharing some really great info. We very much appreciate your insights. As a reminder, we have recorded today's program, so be on the lookout for a follow-up email from ACRL and Choice that will include instructions on how to access the archived version. Thanks again to all of our participants for joining us. I hope you've enjoyed the session. Please enjoy the rest of your day.